Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Before we take up the Hindu analysis, I would like to inform that on the 9th of May at 11 a.m., we shall be hosting a workshop for beginners regarding preparation strategy for UPSC. For those who wish to participate, the registration link for this workshop shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. In a landmark ruling, a 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court has declared the reservation that was provided to the Maratha community in Maharashtra as unconstitutional. See, in 2018, the Maharashtra state government had enacted the Maharashtra State Reservation for Socially and Educationally Backward Classes Act based on the recommendations of the M.G. Gaikwad Commission. This committee had been constituted by the Maharashtra state government to evaluate the social and educational backwardness of the Maratha community, which happens to be the majority dominant community in the state of Maharashtra. Through its findings, the M.G. Gaikwad Commission declared that the Maratha community is socially and educationally backward and underrepresented in government jobs and education, hence deserving of reservation under the other backward classes category. This committee recommended 16% reservation for the Marathas in both education and government employment. And as per these recommendations, the Maharashtra state government enacted this law in 2018, which provided for 16% reservation for the Marathas in education and jobs. This reservation that was extended through this act breached the 50% cap on reservation that had been placed with the Supreme Court through the landmark Indra Savni judgment of 1992. In the Indra Savni judgment, the Supreme Court had ruled that the total reservation provided for SCs, STs, OBCs and other categories cannot exceed 50% of the total vacancies or seats. This cap was placed by the Supreme Court in order to strike a balance between the need for providing affirmative action to socially uplift the backward and oppressed classes while guaranteeing right to equality to all the citizens. But however, the Supreme Court did allow for an exception, and state governments were allowed to breach the 50% cap only under certain specified extraordinary circumstances. As per this exception, if the government was able to prove that a particular community or a caste was backward and providing reservation to this community, even at the risk of breaching the 50% cap, was the only way through which this community could be uplifted. In such exceptional, extraordinary circumstances, the governments were allowed to breach the 50% cap. But this would require the governments to follow due process in order to establish that this community was indeed socially and educationally backward by bringing out sufficient data in order to justify the excess reservation. In the case of reservation granted to the Maratha community, the Maharashtra government relied upon the findings of the Gaikwad Commission, which declared that the Maratha community was indeed backward socially and educationally. But the findings of this commission and the reservation granted to the Maratha community through this act in breach of the 50% cap was challenged at the Bombay High Court in 2019 for its constitutionality. In this case, the Bombay High Court upheld the law and declared that the reservation granted to the Maratha community is constitutional and legally valid even though it breaches the 50% cap. However, the Bombay High Court found the percentage of reservation to be a little high, which was recommended by the Gaikwad Commission, and it ordered the state government to reduce the percentage of reservation to 12% and 13% for education and jobs respectively by suitably amending the law. Following this ruling of the Bombay High Court, the Maharashtra state government amended the 2018 Act, and accordingly the percentage of reservation was brought down from 16% to 12 and 13%. But this ruling of the Bombay High Court was challenged at the Supreme Court on the grounds that the Maratha quota was unconstitutional as it violates the Indra Savni judgment of 1992 and it also violates the right to equality which has been guaranteed under Article 14. This case was taken up by a 5-judge constitution bench of the Supreme Court and it has ruled that the Maratha quota is unconstitutional as the provisions of this law is ultra vires Article 14 and Article 21, which guarantees the fundamental right to equality and the principle of due process of law, respectively. While passing this historic verdict, the Supreme Court has held that providing reservation to the Maratha community not only breaches the 50% cap and the ruling of the Supreme Court in the Indira Savni case, but it also doesn't stand the test of extraordinary circumstances, because it is a well-established fact that the Marathas in Maharashtra are a part of the mainstream and they are politically dominant, and in no ways is the community socially or educationally backward. Then, according to this article on page number 9, the Supreme Court has also ruled that henceforth there is going to be just one single list of socially and educationally backward classes. That would be the central list. See, until now, the states in the center were maintaining their own separate list for socially educationally backward classes. But the introduction of Article 342A had created a confusion over the powers of the states to notify and include socially and educationally backward classes. Now the Supreme Court has clarified that henceforth that there would just be one single list of socially educationally backward classes, that is the central list, which shall be published as per the provisions of Article 342A, Clause 1. According to this constitutional provision, it is the President of India alone who is empowered to notify this list, which essentially means the central government. While notifying this list and while identifying the socially educationally backward classes, the President is guided by the recommendations of the National Commission for Backward Classes, which has been given constitutional status under Article 338B. The Supreme Court has ruled that states, on the other hand, can only provide suggestions to the President and to statutory commissions, such as the National Commission for Backward Classes, with regard to the inclusion or exclusion of any community into this list. So this list shall be prepared by the Centre in consultation with the National Commission for Backward Classes and the respective state governments. And the final list shall be notified by the President as per the provisions of Article 342A, Clause 1. This inherently restricts the powers of the states to identify and accord reservation and other benefits to socially and educationally backward classes. Once this central list is notified by the President, Article 342A, Clause 2 states that the list can be amended only by the Parliament. That is, once the central list has been notified by the President, if any new community has to be included, or if a particular community has to be excluded from the list, then it can be done only through a parliamentary amendment. So these provisions had essentially placed restrictions on the powers of the states with regard to identifying socially educationally backward classes and with regard to granting reservation for them. So this had raised questions over the nature of center-state relations and as well as over federalism, and the Supreme Court has once for all clarified this doubt by ruling that only one single list of socially educationally backward classes shall be maintained, that is the central list, which shall be notified by the President and amended by the Parliament as required. So this reduces the role of the state governments to only providing suggestions to the President, and state governments will also be bound to act in accordance with the provisions of Article 338B when the National Commission on Backward Classes submits a report on matters related to identification of such castes and communities. Until now, the Centre had clarified that these provisions will not affect the powers of the states, but the Supreme Court has set aside this confusion by clarifying that the central list shall be notified only by the President and no other authority shall have that power. Even the powers to include or exclude communities from the list has been vested with the Parliament and not with the state governments. But of course, the states will be free to continue with their policies of reservation within the ambit of Article 15 and 16. And this is likely to help in restricting the misuse of reservation by state governments. So the editorial on page number 6 praises the Supreme Court for upholding the 50% cap on reservation and for allowing its breach only under exceptional circumstances. In this particular case, the Maharashtra government has clearly failed to justify that these circumstances existed with regard to the Maratha community. Political parties, especially at the state level, have often misused reservation as a populist tool, and under the name of addressing social and educational backwardness, they have extended reservation to many upward communities as well, and even to majority and dominant communities by cleverly justifying the breach of 50% cap on reservation. In fact, in this case, several states, including Maharashtra, had requested the Supreme Court to review the Indra Savni judgment because, according to them, the 50% cap was arbitrary and unnecessary, and it was interfering with the powers of the states to uplift the downtrodden communities. But the Supreme Court has clearly rejected this argument of the state governments, and it has refused to review the Indra Savni judgment because in multiple cases, various benches of the Supreme Court have upheld the constitutional validity of the historic Indra Savni judgment of the Supreme Court. Then the other important outcome of this judgment is that state governments were concerned about the impact of 102nd Constitutional Amendment on their powers to grant reservation to backward classes. This constitutional amendment gave constitutional status to the National Commission for Backward Classes under Article 338B, and ever since, states were worried about losing their jurisdiction as a result of the enhanced role and powers of the National Commission for Backward Classes. But now the Supreme Court has issued clarity over this confusion, and it has made it clear that henceforth there shall be just one single central list of socially educationally backward classes, which shall be notified by the President and then amended by the Parliament if required. States can only provide suggestions and recommendations to the President and to the National Commission for Backward Classes. But now that the states' powers have been curbed, they are most likely to push the centre for another constitutional amendment which can overrule this judgment. And as expected, the Chief Minister of Maharashtra has already requested the Prime Minister to bring in such a constitutional amendment which overrules the latest judgment of the Supreme Court. Now let's take up an article from page number 8 that is related to the India-Sri Lanka fishermen issue. According to the article, 86 Indian fishermen who were arrested and detained by the Sri Lankan Navy have been released after they were held for violating the international maritime boundary line. So this brings us to the topic of fishermen issue between India and Sri Lanka. See, this map over here clearly depicts the India-Sri Lanka maritime boundary line, which has been demarcated as per the provisions of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. As per the UN clause, anything beyond the territorial waters has been designated as international waters, which in turn includes the contiguous zone and the exclusive economic zone. Whatever resources are found in a country's exclusive economic zone belongs to that particular country, and this includes hydrocarbons, rare and precious minerals, and as well as fisheries. So vessels of other countries cannot exploit the resources present in the EEZ of another country. Essentially, Indian fishermen cannot cross over the international maritime boundary line and fish in Sri Lankan waters. But since the last 3 to 4 decades, the fishermen issue in and around the Pak Bay and the Gulf of Mannar region has persisted, and it has affected the bilateral relations between India and Sri Lanka. See, there are quite a few reasons why this issue has persisted for several decades. Indian fishermen from Tamil Nadu have largely exhausted their fishing resources in India's exclusive economic zone, as they had resorted to an unsustainable fishing practice known as bottom trawling. Since the 1970s and 1980s, fishermen from Tamil Nadu, they got a lot of subsidies from the state government, which allowed them to procure mechanized boats, through which they had resorted to bottom trawling technique of fishing, which more or less has exhausted the fishing resources in Indian waters. See, in bottom trawling, mechanized boats make use of deep trawler nets, which scoop up anything that is in their path on the bottom of the sea floor. These massive nets are dragged on the sea floor by mechanized boats, and they end up catching huge quantities of fish, many of which are not even consumed, and they even cause serious environmental degradation. Bottom trawling is known to deplete the fishing resources as it is unsustainable and as it doesn't provide enough time for replenishment. It is also known to cause serious damage to the sea floor and other marine animals, including coral reefs. And in the long run, it can even disrupt the biogeochemical cycles. and even affect the rate at which carbon is being sequestered by our oceans. Hence, bottom trawling has been prohibited by several countries, and it is seen to be an unsustainable way of fishing due to its environmental impact. But despite these drawbacks, bottom trawling has persisted in Indian waters along the international maritime boundary line with Sri Lanka, and the fishermen of Tamil Nadu who have exhausted the fishing resources on the Indian side, they often violate Sri Lanka's boundaries and they venture into Sri Lankan waters, which brings them into a direct conflict with the Sri Lankan Navy, the Sri Lankan Coast Guard, and the Sri Lankan fishermen. During such encounters, several fishermen from Tamil Nadu have either been killed or arrested and detained for many years. And considering how emotive this issue is in Tamil Nadu, and considering how politically sensitive the subject is in Tamil Nadu, it ends up turning into a bilateral diplomatic dispute between India and Sri Lanka. See, back in the 1970s, India and Sri Lanka settled their maritime boundary line by signing relevant agreements in 1974 and 76. Through these agreements, India had ceded the Kachativu island to Sri Lanka, where Indian fishermen used to enjoy traditional fishing rights. After ceding the Kachativu island to Sri Lanka, Indian fishermen lost their traditional fishing rights, even though they were allowed to rest on the island and dry their nets, and continue accessing the island for cultural and religious purposes. So the Tamil Nadu fishermen who felt affected by the ceding of Kachativu island to Sri Lanka, they have continued to blatantly violate the maritime boundary line and cross over into Sri Lankan waters. And this is also an aspect which has kept up the fishermen issue. Then during the Sri Lankan Civil War, the waters in and around Park Bay and Gulf of Mannar became a conflict zone, and both the LTTE and the Sri Lankan Navy was known to use these waters, and the fishermen from Tamil Nadu were getting caught in this conflict. In some cases, few fishermen from Tamil Nadu would be enabling the LTTE militants, and in some cases, the Sri Lankan authorities would be seeking information from the Indian fishermen. During the peak of the Civil War, Sri Lankan authorities would be suspicious about any fishing vessel in and around these waters, and on many instances, they have used force against fishing boats, thereby injuring or even killing Indian fishermen. Following the end of the Civil War, the Sri Lankan Navy and the Coast Guard has strictly tried to enforce the maritime boundary line, thereby leading to increased action against Indian fishermen. All these issues have kept the fishermen issue alive, and this has repeatedly affected the India-Sri Lanka bilateral relationship. To resolve this issue, a joint working group was set up back in 2004, but unfortunately, it is yet to make any progress, and hence, no permanent solution has been found yet. As the issue remains unresolved, every now and then such incidents keep occurring, where Indian fishermen tend to cross over into Sri Lankan waters, and they are often apprehended or even sometimes shot by the Sri Lankan authorities. Now let's take up an article from page number 4, which explains the possible reasons behind a recent earthquake that occurred in Sonitpur, located in the northern parts of Assam. See, the northeast of India has been placed under seismic zone 5 in the earthquake hazard map of India, which indicates the high vulnerability of the region to high intensity earthquakes. This high vulnerability of the northeast of India to earthquakes is because the Indian plate is pushing up against the Eurasian plate in an oblique northeast direction, thereby making the entire Himalayan belt seismically very active. In the case of Sonitpur and the northern areas of Assam, the repeated earthquakes have been attributed by the Geological Survey of India to a few fault lines that are located in a tectonically complex triangular zone that has been depicted over here. We have the Atharkhet fault line that runs in an east-west direction located approximately over here, and we have the Kopili fault line that runs in a northwest-southeast direction located approximately over here, and along with this, the Geological Survey of India has discovered a lineament that runs in a north-south direction that completes the triangle. So you should know what a lineament is, as it could be important for prelims. A lineament is basically a linear feature in a landscape, which is an expression of an underlying geological structure such as a fault. The presence of these complex tectonical features is what makes this region, especially northern Assam, a seismically very active zone. And along with this, the presence of many other fault lines and fractures in and around it, such as the Siang fracture, the Yamla fault, Namula thrust, Canyon thrust, etc. They all make the northeast of India highly vulnerable to earthquakes. Next, we have an important policy update from the RBI. According to these two articles from page number 1 and 14, the RBI has announced a set of measures in order to help out the healthcare infrastructure and services, which has come under severe strain as a result of the deadly second wave of the pandemic. The RBI has announced a term liquidity facility of 50,000 crore rupees with a tenure of 3 years and with the interest rate charged at the repo rate in order to facilitate easy credit for healthcare institutions that facilitate emergency healthcare services. Entities such as vaccine manufacturers and importers, suppliers of vaccines, manufacturers of priority medical devices, hospitals, pathology labs, and even manufacturers and suppliers of oxygen cylinders and ventilators, they could all avail the benefits of this scheme and they could gain access to easy and cheap credit under this term liquidity facility that has been opened up by the RBI. Along with this, to protect small and medium businesses and as well as individual borrowers, especially from the impact of the second wave, the RBI has come out with a Resolution Framework 2.0, which would allow these borrowers more time to repay their debt. Next, according to this article from page number 13, the European Union has come out with its updated industrial strategy through which it plans to cut its excessive dependency on Chinese imports and Chinese supplies, especially in critical and strategic sectors such as raw materials, pharmaceutical ingredients, that is APIs or active pharmaceutical ingredients, and semiconductors, etc. European Union countries are heavily dependent on Chinese imports. And hence, this regional grouping has taken an initiative to update its industrial strategy in order to cut Europe's reliance and dependency on China with regard to about 137 sensitive products spanning across several strategic and critical sectors, including pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, etc. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed Europe's dependency on China and how global supply chain shocks can have a huge impact in strategic sectors. So, in order to insulate Europe from such supply chain shocks and also to cut dependency on China in strategic sectors, the European Union has come out with this new industrial policy that will drive the digital and green transformation of Europe in key areas of technology, including batteries, APIs, hydrogen, semiconductors, cloud and edge technologies, etc. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the Supreme Court declared Maratha quota to be unconstitutional as it violates right to equality. Critically evaluate. The second question: write a detailed note on the India-Sri Lanka fishermen dispute. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.